Hello, I am Joe Martin, the Director of the Center for Excellence for Disaster Management and Humanitarian Assistance in Hawaii. This is an abbreviated discussion on foreign humanitarian assistance response logistics, and hopefully about 15-20 minute version of our full-length course called FHA Logistics. It is one of 12 or so modules in the Center's Humanitarian Assistance Response Training course. A little background. I'm a retired Air Force logistics plan, supply of fuels, and logistics readiness officer with nearly 27 years of experience, which included squadron command at Lodges, Eglin, as well as Ali Base in Iraq. And my group command was as the 386 EMSG at Ali Al Salim. I've also had 3 joint tours, one at DLA Energy, U.S. Forces Korea, as well as Indo-PACOM, where I retired in 2016. From a disaster response perspective, I supported Hurricane Katrina from Eglin, was on the PACAF staff during the tsunami and earthquake in 2011 in Japan, was on the Indo-PACOM staff during Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines in 2013, and was a director here at the Center for every disaster in Indo-PACOM since 2014, to include the Nepal earthquake in 2015. So let's talk about logistics and foreign humanitarian assistance. As mentioned, the set of slides I'm using are fully annotated. We even have instructor guides, which you can request for your personal use or inclusion into appropriate service-specific logistics training. My goal is to reach each Logie and affect their abilities to support natural disasters. Let's begin. The intent of this 15 to 20 minute session will be to go basically from big to small. Try and stay focused exclusively on logistics. As mentioned, the Center has multiple modules that go deeper onto other issues, and you are certainly welcome to take those at your leisure. The image in this slide shows the catastrophic damage from the tsunami and earthquake in 2004. It trends, if you can, towards a complex adaptive systems concept, which really deals with complexity theory that focuses on how do you emerge order from chaos. Simply looking at what happened, in which almost 250,000 people died in a single day, is pretty impossible to even put your mind around. And then when you look at the quote here, where really the center of the gravity for this response was that of logistics, that brings to mind and brings to bear the importance of what we do all the more. It's important to contemplate as well that somewhere between 60 and 80% of all support during disasters is logistics, and oftentimes those unique military capabilities are the most urgent, particularly early in an event. No briefing would be complete without a couple of definitions, and you can see the one from JP 4.0 here. However, I think the importance here is to understand the differences when thinking about humanitarian logistics. Oftentimes, there are more considerations for cost effectiveness, a deeper focus on those requested goods and materials, as well as information sharing, because the point of all of it is to obviously try to get those things most necessary, most effectively, to those people most in need. This slide here simply pulls up a few of the logistics challenges that you would experience in a natural disaster, which you may not see in a conflict environment. Extreme time pressures, for example, when humans are suffering. The movement away from pull logistics versus push logistics. As well as contemplating that the environment that you go into probably has significant damage to almost all of its logistics infrastructure and facilities. Additionally, you will be in an environment in which there are multiple actors participating, all seeking out the same open space, the same helicopter landing places, and the same facilities in which to actually function and operate. Listed on this slide are some of the most common items requested during a natural disaster. You may see some things which are very similar to what you would experience in a conflict environment as well, some of which may be significantly different. The point is that oftentimes these are what the military is most likely to look for or to be looked at to help to provide. The primary purpose is really to fill those immediate gaps following a disaster. It is pretty well accepted that the military forces from around the world, and specifically within the United States, have a disaster response capacity that is hard to beat. So what are some of the unique expeditionary capabilities that the DoD brings to bear? Each of the 4 items listed here we can go into significant detail on, but the point is that as a military response force, these exist and are in the arsenal of those things capable to be brought in disaster. The upper picture shows the port facilities in Port-au-Prince, Haiti after the disaster, in which some of the JTF port opening folks went in and provided support. The bottom are the JTAC controllers, I believe at the airfield also in Haiti, providing air traffic control support, and others as goods and services were landed at that location. I want to now take the topic to looking at the command and control and those relationships necessary at a couple of different levels. So this is where we'll really start to go big to small. So if you're at a combatant command, for example, and we'll use INDOPACOM, what are the things that you as a logistician or one of the service component commands would be most concerned with? What are the issues that the Joint Task Force will experience when they hit the ground, and what information do they need? Obviously, access, situational awareness. There's some very specific questions which rise every time with respect to diplomatic clearances, and there also can be issues, believe it or not, with taxes, etc. Also, what information is available there? What really exists and what condition is it in? You want to be able to provide that information to those forces going forward. Similarly, you may be looking at or looking for previous surveys or assessments. You can actually at the command stand up a logistical operational planning team, and as well as look at providing best practices and lessons for items such as, hey, what do you do if suddenly there's a request or a concept to do an airdrop? Or what do you do and how do you recommend support for unsolicited donations? A few slides ago there was a picture of a whole bunch of clothing material basically splattered all over the ground. Those were all clothing donations to the people of the Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan. And if I remember correctly, the vast majority had to be burned because they sat in the rain and started to rot, unused by the people who many people thought they were doing a really good deal for. But if you're not at the combatant command level and are actually either fortunate or unfortunate enough to be put onto a joint task force moving forward, what are some of the logistics considerations that should come to mind for you? First, I would say that the top label here, the USAID one, there's a Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs who is the lead federal agent for disaster response. They typically will establish a DART team, a disaster assistance response team, which advises the ambassador and other members of the country team on necessary things for support. Well, you better make contact with that person pretty quick, preferably before you ever leave the ground. Similarly, the bottom icon represents UNOCHA, so the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. They will probably be there. They will be there before you get there, and they will probably be there after you leave, vying for and working through some of the same issues, but at the international level. Unlike when at the command level, where you're simply trying to figure out what is actually there, in this case, at the JTF logistics level, you want to verify that those things actually are still functional, all the way to road surfaces, bridges, tunnels, etc., in order to provide information and capacity to figure out where either other forces or your own can provide assistance to renovate or to rejuvenate those capacities, or to actually use them if they're still functional. Other considerations for the JTF include information sharing. I will assure you that at the end of most major events, there will be an audit of some type. If you don't believe me and you know Brigadier General, Major General retired Brent Baker. Brent was the A4 at PACAF when he went forward to support Operation Tomodachi in Japan. And the audit after that covered probably somewhere between $50 and $80 million worth of support. But the question now becomes, where do you fit into this overall process? It is entirely possible on the slide here, many of the acronyms you won't recognize. The point being is that as a logistician, if you need to get, maintain, and sustain awareness of these in a forward movement for logistics support. For example, the NDMO, or the National Disaster Management Office for the United States, is FEMA. However, in the Philippines, it's OCD, the Office of Civil Defense. Those are basically the people who will be determining the requirements and what is necessary for that particular country. UNOCHA I mentioned before. UNOCHA has a presence in many countries and deploys forces forward to coordinate the international humanitarian assistance piece. They do that oftentimes through an organization called an OSOC, or the On-Site Operations Coordination Center, in which requests for support in many areas, not just logistics, come in and get coordinated. They do that through a process called SimCoord. You see the definition there, in which basically OCHA officers or OCHA civilians coordinate across different functional lines, both within the country and to military organizations. The picture that I showed you on the previous slide, a couple slides ago, was the UN cluster system, in which the UN has figured out a way to organize the types of support, the levels of support, and to coordinate that support in a fairly organized fashion. The big one for logisticians, of course, would be the logistics cluster, which is actually run and managed at a deployed site by the World Food Program. Interesting, the WFP also does the emergency telecommunications cluster. And in certain cases, you may have a multinational coordination center. And this is the place where all the military forces get together and can collaborate and provide support, oftentimes specifically through military channels. So what does this request process look like? And how do you get to the point at which the military would actually be those providing the service? On the upper left-hand side, you can see where a need is identified, basically by the country, by the region, by the district, whatever. Is the host nation capable? Is there a UN agency capable of doing that? Or does it need to get submitted, and FMA is Foreign Military Assistance, or is it appropriate for that? If it is, that request for assistance, and particularly if it's for the U.S., can go to a request that says, hey, we need this type of support. So think in terms of those common DoD support requirements I mentioned earlier. Rarely will you see things such as food on here, but you may see airlift, vertical lift, particularly with helicopters, perhaps some engineering support, and other such things. So this is really the military request process. The point being they can come from very different locations, ultimately to come down to some military force, perhaps the U.S. military force providing it. On the bottom right-hand side, if that request comes down and is properly vetted and deemed appropriate for U.S. military forces to provide, it is actually signed by the Bureau of Humanitarian Affairs, that USAID person, and use a form called a MITAM. So we're going to get a little bit technical here for just a second, but bear with me because this next slide provides basically that tasking document that says, hey, here's what we need you to do. This slide is also interesting, as I mentioned the audit piece earlier. This is also the means by which often military forces can substantiate their expenses to then get reimbursed. There's a whole other presentation on costs and expenses with respect to disasters, but I will tell you is that if you are a service component providing a support in a disaster, your financial folks will definitely want to be able to get whatever expenses back. I now just want to give a quick shameless plug before I wrap things up for the World Food Program and their logistics cluster. It truly is a remarkable group of folks, and if you're going to be engaged in humanitarian logistics, this is really a group that you need to understand what their capacities are and what their location is. Their budget is in the several billions of dollars every year. They actually have access to their own fleet of ships, trucks, and helicopter support. And truly they are there to provide that sort of top-down logistics assistance to pretty much any disaster in the world. So how do you get more? How do you get smarter on some of this? This list here shows many of the regulations and publications that could be of use to you. This is a different series of documents than you would see in normal logistics or logistics support analysis planning. And it's important that you understand those variations. So take a look at them. The other thing I would recommend is there's a couple of websites at the top, two of which the links are specifically from CFE here in Hawaii. One lists 30 some odd books that we have out there that give you all the information you would need with respect to specific countries, to include how they're organized and what their greatest hazards are. And then we actually have a best practices booklet just for logistics, which is highly recommended. There's other ones for Joint Task Force commanders, how to receive support, as well as information sharing, gender issues, etc. So if you get a chance, Before you go someplace, take a look at these things. So to recap, it is important to acknowledge that every disaster brings those unique logistics challenges. There's also variations, as we talked about, between how do you do logistics planning and execution for a disaster than what perhaps you would do for a conflict type environment. Think through the fact that you really are pulling requirements forward rather than pushing ahead projected items of things that people may or may not need. And then the unique logistics capacities of the Department of Defense really can meet some of those critical and urgent first-time requirements. So this is my contact data, and you are welcome to reach out to me, or most importantly, sneak a peek at the website down at the bottom to gather, steal, or borrow any information that you find here or there useful to you. I'm hopeful that this tailored version of the Center's logistics module has been both informative as well as sparked a curiosity in some viewers to go deeper. HADR response remains the most likely mission for most military forces, so you can either learn it now or you can learn it on the tarmac at the scene of a disaster. It's your call.